really nothing to it. One.
Yeah, give it to Or Donnie. No, I'm joking here.
I asked him. I haven't seen him today. He said he said are we going to go into executive session? Well, it's up to you if you want to. Techie person.
What do you need?
He's trying to get money balance.
I sent a Zoom.
Email, why is that?
I didn't actually see a link.
There, I got up in 2 seconds. She
You
said
put your stuff
You saw me, I was looking.
Did you call back?
Just making sure they're not shooting daggers at us. I guess I just that's all. That way we can see all the nests. Yeah.
Hey, you guys.
What?
Hey, you're nice and tall. You can sit right there.
Musical chairs. No, we just wanted to be able to see everybody.
Also.
Well, I was trying to do this stuff. There's something history about what's it going to take from Anderson Corner. I have to look for the stop sign and see one of those reflectors. And I can look for those reflectors. Well, there's no one. I'm just trying to make that left turn.
It's just for the stop sign.
Are we ready?
We're having a hard time with the Zoom. I thought I created a Zoom this morning. Yep, sure. Sorry, David. Everybody?
I think before we went to check that's why so he can say student. Should I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. If someone like to take a minute and look over the agenda, somebody want to make a motion to adopt the agenda as is?
I'll make a motion to adopt the agenda as is.
Second? All in favor? Okay, our first order of business is the bullying. Dr. Johnson, how are we going to go about this?
Well, I don't know what the questions were. I think this is in response to a community complaint or a concern that was brought to the board at the last official board meeting. And I think Mrs. Ramos would want to have a meeting to make sure that the board is informed. I think occasionally the board gets calls from parents concerned about expressing concerns to you. And you're often like, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to answer this question. obviously, the first response is to refer them back to the principal. Have you spoken to the principal? Have you spoken to the superintendent or the assistant superintendent or what?
The teacher first.
The teacher certainly, aware of that. So, but I realize that there are certain situations where, maybe they have, and it's ongoing, and they're still concerned. And so, one of the reasons the principals and vice principals are here is for them to be able to answer questions. And again, we cannot use specific names of students today. But I don't know if the board has any specific questions that they would like our administration to address, me here or principals or our special ed director.
Do all three of the schools have the same policy or?
We all have
This
one
one
policy.
Yeah, it's
Is it them?
Get it? Which one is it, Pat?
JFCF.
JFCF dash
And
AR.
there's JFCFAR, which explains what an AR is, an administrative regulation, and it tells how the steps are gone through. And I'm sure you're all aware of these policies.
JFCF dash AR. I can go get off a copy for everybody here. Do you have one? Let me just make a copy of that.
You can get it on your phone.
I just want to make sure everybody has it here. They can pull it up. Okay.
These guys.
You do it,
Better game, buddy.
I have the policy.
And then I would also like to point out that we have another policy in the student section called threats of violence, which, can go hand in hand with bullying. Because as we well know, bullying sometimes involves the threat of, physical harm. So.
But I believe in that specific instance has already been resolved. Is that correct?
The one that was brought up in the public comment?
Yes.
Was it Mr. Murray? It was elementary, I think.
It was resolved to the extent that that student went through an official, per policy, went through an expulsion hearing, which was convened with a number of administrators and teachers. It was determined to return that student to school. Following that, there was a threat assessment protocol that we went through, where we interviewed a number of people related to that student and determined that there was no imminent threat when that student did return to school. He returned with a safety plan in place and really no contact of any kind with the rest of the population, and that's ongoing. That's an ongoing situation. So there is no threat to anyone at the school.
But the student is having no interaction with the remainder of the student population.
Correct.
Is that appropriate when we are trying to, mainstream our students?
Well, it's obviously not the least restrictive environment to use special education language and so on, but given the situation, obviously safety is our first concern, and we do have a plan in place to return that student to the classroom if he can demonstrate that he would be safe.
Can I just make a quick correction? It was the expulsion hearing. It wasn't actually an expulsion hearing. It was a manifest determination hearing based on his IEP. And we looked at his disability and whether that was impacting the actions that took place. And so through that, then we determined that it was due to his disability. And that's why we made the change in placement and decided not to go with the expulsion hearing at this time.
Is there a certain number of times that there's an incident of bullying before you get to, how many times does an incident have to occur before it's considered bullying?
I know it says repeated, the definition, but how many times is repeated? Is it twice, is it 10
Well, I mean-
times? Is it-
Well, I think that's gonna come down to certain circumstances of that.
It's a judgment call, and also you have to take into account the severity of it, right? So
Right.
the main issue is, number one, we want to protect students, and number two, we want to support teachers and help parents feel like their children are safe and supported. And I think the complaint we heard recently was a parent who felt like this had happened a lot, and they were frustrated, and their child was tired of it. And we're talking specifically about the elementary. The policy equally applies to all schools. I don't know, when we get complaints from the public, we deal with them. So I think the question comes from a lot of parents is, why does this kid have the right to be at school? If they've done this many times, or this severe, why are they still here?
Can I ask the question, does that constitute bullying? The reality of the world is a single event with one student doesn't constitute bullying, right? We get a negative interaction between two individuals, correct? And even though this kid might be the common denominator, it's not a bullying event, it's a conflict between two students at that point, right? It could be even a physical conflict. It can be emotional, it can be physical, it can be psychological, right? Or it can be social, right? But it has to be ongoing, repeated, and deliberate is a really, really common term, right? In terms of when we look at bullying events, or if something is a bullying event. So for example, if this kid had an interaction with this student, right, that wasn't acceptable in terms of, let's say, simple, not keeping hands to self, right? So harm the student, right? And he or she then goes multiple weeks without having another event with that student, right? But then has another event with another student. That doesn't constitute bullying, it's a separate student. Right?
There's a difference between being mean and being a
Correct.
Sometimes kids are just
An
mean.
inappropriate, mean event doesn't necessarily, on its own merit, constitute bullying, right? That has to be pervasive and ongoing. There has to be an unequal balance of power, right? Whether it be between one individual from a physical standpoint, or a social standpoint, or a status standpoint, right? So that's one of the factors when you look at the definition in state law, right? That has to, it's in there. And so I think that's where we get kind of confused is are certain things bullying behaviors, or are they just negative peer interactions that go through our student code of conduct, right? And they can start out being investigated as a bullying incident. Kid could refer to it as bullying, but then you look at it, that was a mutual disagreement of kids of equal status, right? Just calling each other bad names in the locker room happened one day and we both had a really bad day. It doesn't necessarily constitute bullying. Especially later, well, my friend had the same negative interaction with this kid. Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily constitute bullying in that individual's situation. Yes, your friend had a negative interaction with this kid, you had a negative interaction with this kid and your other friend, but it doesn't necessarily constitute bullying of those three individuals on a repeated standpoint, right? So I think those are things that I as a principal and we as an administrative team look at, I think. Yeah.
So if it's not considered bullying, is there still a response to negative behavior?
Oh, absolutely. So our policy, right, that's in our in you know that Pat just brought up, for example, it isn't really clear on what the response will be. Like in our handbook, it has a list of potential responses, and they include things as simple as they might do restorative justice, right, where they're working together, or they might do peer mediation, or almost always there's an education component, right, that starts with you have to be put on kind of notice, right? And some of that's through trainings where we go into classrooms or we go at the start of the year and set expectations, right? And say these are behaviors that we want to see, that need to be seen. This is how you report a negative interaction with a peer, right? And so educate as we go through, but that kid, if they have an event that with another peer, you go through the process of this is not okay. They did not like this. Did they tell you to stop? Did they use it? Like we have the stop phrase at the middle school, right? When a kid sticks their hand in the stops, kids know that they're supposed to not run through the stop sign. And if they do, then that gets reported because it's not tattletelling, it's reporting them because the person didn't respect your response, right? And your boundary. And so then those things come and then we educate, why did you not stop when that boundary was put up, right? And if you don't continue to do that, things continue to escalate, I guess, from a discipline standpoint. Like those kids will lose privileges, right? Like maybe they lose restricted areas on the playground. When they go to recess, they're only in this area to be monitored closely by an adult, right? They only get to play certain games potentially because that game is a trigger for them because it allows them to physically bully somebody, right? For example, maybe they don't play foursquare basketball because it leads to, right? Or it goes all the way that you're no longer allowed extracurricular activities, you don't transfer in the hall with same kids, we change class schedules. So there's a variety of techniques that get used to kind of, at the middle school level at least, to address those types of issues.
Well, I think that's true of the other schools as well. A variety of interventions that you handle. And I don't ever want to dismiss a parent calling or coming to complain or be frustrated about something. But I think it's important that maybe perhaps we as a school need to do better about notifying parents what we have done. Because the fact is, when a parent comes in all wound up, whether they call one of you or whether they call me, and at some point they're angry, one of the things we need to go back to is how often has this happened to your child, right? Yeah, okay, so over many years, or something was severe, I think, if somebody brings a knife, whatever the intention is at school to use that, or they seem to target a kid. Sometimes if we don't know, if the parent feels, the child feels that they're targeted, we're just dealing with bad behaviors all over the place from one or two individuals. And so I don't want to dismiss parent concerns. I don't want to downplay anything that has gone on, but I will tell you this, as a board and as a community and whatever else, when we hear about bad behavior, we deal with it. We work with the kids, we work with the families, and I think every one of the principals can speak to that. Go ahead.
Did this situation happen because this child was on an IEP and you can't disclose that to the complaining parent, so they think nothing was done?
Right. I think part of it is that, there are certain things that we have to keep confidential, and we have to also think about the student's disability and how that's handled, and we had to handle that in a different way. And I think, like you said, is this the best situation for him being in this restricted environment? Our objective is to teach him those skills that he needs to learn to be able to go out into that environment eventually as well. But right now we're working on those skills with him, and we're working in a very restricted environment so that we can make sure that everybody is safe.
And not just IEP students. We don't talk about students' attendance to non-parents and guardians. Like that's just a no-no. So I think probably a lot of us, we generally at the end of a conversation with a parent, will generally say, "Now I need you to trust me that we're going to take care of this." I can't call you and say, "This is how long I suspended Johnny for," or anything like that.
Somebody else's child.
Yeah, because I wouldn't do the same thing if it was your kid. And most parents go, "Yeah, okay, I can see that." And usually they're smart enough to figure out by the time they're in high school that their kid can look and see how long they so not been in school today. They usually figure it out.
I do think one thing that's helpful is all three sites now have an incident reporting form that might not necessarily be for bullying. It could be any incident that occurs, right? It's got a whole range. Mr. Daly, who's our district counselor, took a form that we've been using at the middle school. Obviously, if you look through the current procedures, it doesn't spell out what the process will be. It just says you'll investigate it, right? And so, like our handbook lists out kind of what the process will be. And then we've been using that form, and so that form is now available to everybody under the counseling drop down in all three buildings, and also at the district level. You'll be able to report any incident. So it could be something that might be construed as sexual harassment, could be a cyberbullying incident, could be where they're going to have a fight. I know someone's been stealing something, and so it identifies those things and allows them to report any incident. And so a lot of times we do that, and that kind of puts the players together. So when we are investigating, we know who the witnesses are that we have to start talking to, right? And a lot of times we find out, hey, we use the example like if this person is, chipping away at you and you choose to chip back, you're now participating, you're now escalating, right? It's now no longer one person, right? You're now going up with them, right? So the idea that if you want to stay clean, for lack of a better word of it, you can't respond back in an inappropriate way to set your boundaries with them, right? And so I think that's part of the process. That person said these 3 mean things to me. Yeah, but you also said these 4 mean things to them. So they started first, so it made it okay. It really doesn't in those situations. The behavior is not acceptable by either one of you. That's not how we work through a process of conflict resolution. So those are things then that we work through as administrators or with the counseling staff to kind of help show what's a conflict resolution that you could have done here rather than both gone to name calling or physical confrontation.
And something new we've done this year is we've spent time in PE classes and going over these things, like how to set a boundary, how to report, where to report, that type of thing. So they've heard it at least 3 times this year.
And you're talking about the middle school.
At the middle school, this thing that he's doing.
PBIS
Track. Yeah, like even a hand deal, that's, I mean, everybody knows when we start going like this, like, all right,
Talk about setting boundaries.
yeah, you gotta stay here, you can't go here with them, you know, so.
So elementary.
Yeah, well, I think I should just make a distinction here. I do not feel that there's a bullying issue at the elementary school. There's an issue with a student, particular student. Certainly there were some bullying matters with that student. But to describe the situation at the school as a bullying situation or a bullying issue is just not accurate. This year, I would say alone, we probably had maybe 2 or 3 incidents of what I would call bullying. Do we have behavior issues? Absolutely we do. In fact, one of our major initiatives this year is behavior. And as Dr. Johnson just mentioned, we've re-implemented our PBIS program, which is Positive Behavioral Intervention and Supports, which is a school-wide program for behavior in general with students. We've dealt with behaviors beginning last year that we never saw before, particularly at the lower level. And so behavior issues, absolutely, definitely addressing them proactively, but not bullying on any kind of an endemic basis.
So what would you say is the difference between the two? What do you think constitutes bullying? In the elementary level, because, I mean, that's where it starts, right? Is elementary, so a lot of this is on your shoulders.
Sure.
What is bullying?
Well,
what do you feel?
What do I think bullying is?
Yeah.
I think bullying is when one person is fearful of another for whatever reason, whether it's because of a verbal threat, physical threat, something like that, just generally speaking.
And what does it take for you to have this counsel or whatever about it? This expulsionary hearing?
Well, in that situation, it was because a knife was brought to school.
So, and this is a little personal for me because I had a daughter in elementary school that we had problems with 1 or 2 guys bullying a group of young women, I mean, sexually harassing, physically threatening. And we came in there several times. I know the other parents did several times. And nothing happened until they got to the middle school. And then stuff started happening. So if you have a parent that comes in complaining, you have evidence that these things are going on, what do you do about it? I know we want to keep these kids in school, okay? I do too. I want to keep them in school. I don't want to send them home where they're not going to get looked after and it might get worse. But what do we do about it at that point? Because nothing got done for 3 years.
David.
I don't know the situation that you're referring to. So you're talking about something you said nothing got done, and I'm not sure what we're talking about here. But there are a number of things that we do and protocols that we do follow. Obviously we suspend students. We have parent conferences. We provide counseling. We provide interventions that we can. We don't have a location to take these students to outside of the school. So I mean, to the extent of the tools that I have,
We don't have Ms. Reese, we have a
Sure,
school
right.
suspension. But
That doesn't give them access to the academic piece that they're supposed to be getting the same way.
if it's extended. that's
I always
correct.
had to send work and stuff, but then she wrote.
We do send work, but if it's extended, if it's multiple days, you are missing instructions.
I guess my question is at what point, I don't know how to say this right, but at what point is this put back on parents? And And that's tough because that's part of the problem with some of these kids, right? They don't have that parenting. But if they don't ever get in trouble for anything, they'll keep doing it.
Well, and I would have to say, with every one of the schools, kids are getting in trouble, right? So the purpose of discipline is to change behavior, right? And so sometimes it's what works for one kid. If you put a child, you suspend him from school, either out of school or in school, that's devastating to that child and that family. They don't like that. They change their behavior. But to other kids, it's like, great, no big deal.
I feel like in this complaint, there were two parts to it. There was the bullying aspect, but then also not the removal aspect. So he was still allowed at school. At what point is there documented proof that he's a threat?
And of course, every parent's going to want the kid kicked out, right?
Well,
That's not always the
There's
case.
also a law though where you're not supposed to suspend elementary students without coming up with all of these plans to keep them in school. And so that's the one difference between middle school is that we can start to do that more. We've also been implementing alternative discipline because, like you're talking about, instead of just hitting them with suspensions all the time, we're really trying to change the behavior. So that involves them doing research, having restorative justice meetings. We do call parents, and then I do ask that I really emphasize reporting. So if it continues to go on, they need to call us within 24 hours. I mean, they obviously can do longer than that, but we don't hear anything, and we assume that it's done. But one of the pieces that I found that was sort of missing was my own follow-up, and so now I have a document on my computer, and I call back and say, has anything else happened? Or I'll call the kid and see has anything else happened? And so I think that the alternative discipline stuff has been pretty powerful for some kids where it's not just a suspension, go to Miss Reese, it's a learning process because that's what you ultimately want to do, right, is to change the behavior. But I know that that's one thing that, because I was a SPED director for the district, and so for the elementary kids, that's one thing that makes it difficult is you're really supposed to limit how much you suspend elementary kids fifth grade.
So I guess maybe that's my question is how do we change their habits? How do we change their behavior? I know, and I commend you guys for what you do, but
I mean, we do like to give parents a chance to parent. So I'll call and say, I want to give you a chance to talk with your kid. And so a lot of times that will happen, but that's not every phone call that we make,
But the question of the victims, the kids who are victims, as in the case of your daughter, is always, why is that kid still there? Why is that kid still at school? Why is that kid still allowed to continue to do this? And the fact is, well, sometimes teachers act. I mean, I was a principal vice principal for 21 years. And so I would have teachers say, well, I sent them to the office and you didn't do anything. And I said, well, you've had them for 45 days. What behavior have you changed in the child? Right? And it's perhaps a smart alecky response, but the fact is we're all working, trying to figure out how to change a child's behavior, which is in some cases a mystery to us all. The behaviors that we see, we issue the discipline that we know, and then we have to change it. Sometimes we have to change what we're doing. In the instance of this child, that I think was referenced in the regular board meeting and has been referenced tonight, I'm aware that there's a discipline record that we have of that child that shows that there were interventions being done. The parents felt like they're particularly targeting my child, but to what degree did we all know that the parents felt that way before somebody finally got hot and called a board member or called somebody else and said, I am sick of this, it needs to stop now? Well, to them, it had built up over time, when in fact we didn't know it was that parent felt their child was the target, was bullying. It was legitimately bullying in that parent's mind, right? And that anything we would describe bullying as, that it fit that as the parent described it. But I just have to say, in the case of our principals, they are dealing with behavior. When it comes to them, they deal with it. They work with the children, they work with the families. And whether it changes overnight, just doesn't do that all the time. In the PBIS model that we use, there's lots of studies been done about student behavior. I remember some of the things we tried there at the elementary school. It's called a pyramid. pyramid of behaviors. Those of you familiar with schools know there's a pyramid of behaviors. It's probably true in society too when we talk about policing, right? But between 2 and 5% of the whole population, so you have 550 kids,
Right.
what's 2% of that?
2% of 550.
10. So we have 10 kids that are your high flyers. If that's, you spend probably the vast majority of his time with those 10 kids. Hopefully it's not 10, but it might be.
Matt and I went in and visited with Matt, and he explained to me a lot about the situation and what had been done. And I was very happy with things that you said. My concern is in part, I recognize that at the elementary school level, kids aren't going to deal with this, stop, you're encroaching on my boundaries, because a lot of them don't know what boundaries are yet at the age of 6 or 7. In the complaint, it was listed that this student had been a distraction for 3 years and had threatened other students with knives and had gotten away with it. And I mean, I'm just looking at the complaint. And that's more, if you threaten with a knife, that's more than just a bullying thing. That becomes a danger thing, that becomes a threat.
Absolutely.
So, and, I'm sure that you have that down so that there is a record. And I went to the session that Bobby DeLeon had during parent-teacher conference on bullying. And I wish that all of us had done that, because to me it was very enlightening. And that form that he has, that he described, I think is a very good form to have, because it gives you tracking.
Just to clarify, that parent has said that, although that information has never come to light. Last year or this year, when the student brought the knife this year, there was no threat with the knife. There was no brandishment or anything like that. And previous issues of a knife with that student, if they existed, I was not aware of them. They were not brought to us by any staff member or student.
Her report.
Yeah.
So, but as I said, I felt very comfortable after our discussion, Matt.
Certainly, any student who was to bring a knife to school and threaten others with it, that would become a police matter. It would go outside and beyond.
And we did conduct a threat assessment, even though he didn't use it in a threatening way. It was more of a safety assessment just to make sure we had that plan in place.
Well, Oregon has a capability of 12, so you can't be charged formal unless you're 12 years older. But a juvenile count does informal stuff for underage.
Well, I just want to say a couple things. So when a parent calls a board member, one of the first things that I always ask parents if they call me is, have you spoken to the child's teacher? Have you spoken to the principal? And if the answer is yes, in both of those instances, I invite them to fill out policy KL-AR. Now that doesn't remove the responsibility of Mr. Hawkins or me from conducting an investigation ourselves if they don't fill out KL-AR, but that is the public complaint procedure. It formalizes a process. It allows parents to give them some power to say, hey, this has gone on, I'm sick of it. It formalizes it for a principal to say, hey, obviously we need to look into this differently.
Well, I think it'd be the example of like, you don't feel like the kid received any discipline, right? Maybe it involved my son or my daughter, and I think that the student that was the perpetrator, right, didn't receive any discipline. Well, they could come back and go, I heard that this happened, right? And so we'll sit down and have a meeting like, this is what we actually did with this student, right? If that's information we can give them, right? To kind of alleviate, or at least discuss what we did, right? And if that answer is not appropriate, that was a decision that we made as an administrative team. That decision then gets appealed to Dr. Johnson, right? And if Dr. Johnson then looks at it and says, you know what, that probably wasn't the appropriate discipline for this student in this situation. It's very well that he, as my boss, says, you'll do something different. I don't feel that you were appropriate, right? And so this additional discipline will be rendered for the student, which that would be the process. And then if that doesn't happen, then it comes to you, right, in terms of being able to process through the situation. Because at no time do I think every decision I make is completely right. Right?
Well,
I try to make
and the
good
teachers
decisions.
question you sometimes saying, you know, that didn't do anything. The kid's back in my class after I complained, and they're doing it again.
But I need to know specifically what you found with the situation that wasn't satisfactory. Does that make sense? So we can address that piece of it, because I don't believe anytime every component's incomplete in their mind, right? Or we wouldn't be having the discussion, right? Something happened to that student. Somebody talked to that student somewhere. It might not have been the discipline that you would hope that student would receive, but it doesn't mean that they didn't receive some discipline of some type, right? Or at least some parental communication with that kid. So that's my deal, is that process exists so we can address specifics of that parent's concerns or that constituent's concerns, I guess.
So, Gina,
Yes.
if you would talk about a manifestation determination a little bit, perhaps who was there, who does come to those?
Yeah, so we had, in that situation, we had the parent there, we had the administrators, and Dr. Johnson was there, I was there, the case manager, student's case manager, and the teacher. And then we talked specifically about the situation. In this case, it was the situation with the knife. That's what we were addressing, and whether or not that was a threat, and the way that it came about, whether it was a manifestation of his disability. And so when we talked about that, if a student has a disability such as ADHD, you know, it tends to be those types of things where they're impulsive and they make irrational decisions and they make those bad decisions. And so we have to look and see, could this be part of his disability that caused him to behave this way or not? And then from there, we decide if it is part of his disability, what do we need to do in terms of his IEP to fix this? And that could be looking at his behavior plan. Have we conducted a functional behavior assessment? Do we need to conduct a new one? Do we need to revise that behavior plan or add some additional social emotional goals, those kinds of things? If we say, no, it's not a part of his disability, it kind of goes the same way. We look again at what are the consequences that need to happen in both situations, and what do we need to fix with his IEP or his behavior plan or anything like that to help him to make the right decisions the next time. And then from there, we do that education piece, and where we're giving that direct instruction on what needs to be done so that this doesn't happen again. And that's kind of where we're at right now, is just providing that direct instruction, working on the behavior plan, working on those social skills goals, and so forth.
Yeah, we don't have, I think someone addressed this earlier, you know, like if a child is kind of past all of, is not complying or learning, changing behaviors with all of the things that we try, the question is then what, right? So we don't have a lot of institutionalized homes or I don't know what else is out there for kids who are troubled or have really troubled childhoods. You know, Donna, you dealt with a lot of that. But we do work with the agencies, and you talked about the people that were there. There were multiple counselors from multiple agencies.
Yes, and yeah, through ESD, we had the counselor there from ESD, and then we also refer parents to like Lifeways for those crisis moments and that type of outside therapy as well. So, you know, we try to bring that in. We can't really force parents to do that outside therapy, but we do give them the resources and the information so that they can get that assistance as well.
So we can offer reassurance to the parents who feel like, hey, my kids just want to go to school and feel safe. They're tired of being targeted. They're nice, and for some reason somebody is targeting them. So to reassure those parents that their kids can come to school and not feel threatened and not be bullied. So I just want the board, when people call you, to be able to have answers, you know, I think hopefully our principals are very trustworthy, they do work, and if I need to share, if board members want to share, see, what principals are doing for the discipline record, you can come in and I can show you those things. The principals are doing those. Not always entering them the day of, they get it in, they work with the kids and the families and the parents, right? So I just want you guys, all of you, to feel like if a parent calls you and is hot, or if it's you, that you've had an experience, please allow us to answer that, or to the parent say, if you've done all of these things, please fill out the public complaint policy, turn it in to me, to the district office, to Megan Glenn, to Darren Johnson, to Ryan Hawkins, to the principal, whoever. I'm not going to talk to that principal again. They're not doing anything. We've heard that, right? And so, well, turn it into me then, and I'll get it to Darren, right? I'll print it off and give it to you if you want. So, and if you don't, send an email. Here's Johnson's email. Here's my email. Formalize the complaint that way, and we can look into it. So, I just want our principals to know. I'm very confident that our principals are dealing with issues, and not every issue just is solved overnight. There's some challenging issues that we have to deal with. We have children who come to us who, if any of us knew the environment they were raised in from the age of birth, doesn't excuse their behavior. It's still annoying and it's still a problem, but it certainly gives a better understanding to say, oh my goodness, I didn't know that. Like, what do we provide to this child to help them get on a better track? Again, the goal of discipline is to change behavior. It's not to show them who's boss, it's not to slap them down, it's not to embarrass them, it's to change their behavior. And so we're looking at ways that we can change the behavior of a child who obviously doesn't know how to behave in a setting where everybody's just trying to get along, right? Needing to get along for cooperation. We're focused on learning, and some kids are trying to learn how to behave. I mean, it's a challenge, right? But I just want to assure the board that we are doing, there is a process for you to follow in order to answer a parent who comes to you very upset and frustrated about a situation. We don't want to discount what they say. We want to pursue that and look into it.
So the parent that made the complaint that said, I want an answer, do we need to give her something in writing or just say that we talked about it and review the policy?
What would you like? I can respond to what you like. And,
Sure.
And just the board met and discuss some situations. Just formalize a response. I can forward it to you later so that you have what we discussed.
And I think that you could also include just saying that responses have been made to the situation, but due to privacy laws, we can't disclose what that is. And so that way it's not that we're trying to hide anything, but we're following the law.
Yes. That's good. That's good.
I have a question. Luke, you referred to your handbook outlining the steps of what would happen if, poor behavior or bullying occurs. Do we have that in the elementary school handbook?
We do.
Okay, and I'm assuming that it's in the high school.
Yes.
Okay, so the information is out there.
And the parents are supposed to read that and sign it.
Well, that's all the parents read it.
They sign
They
it.
said,
They sign it.
And it's also got a copy of the electronic form that's online on the back end.
I would just ask if you get a call from a parent that says, I already told them, and it kept going, and I would ask, have you called them back to let them know it happened again? That's what I was trying to emphasize with the reporting pieces. So I'll tell them on the phone, it may happen again, but if it does, I need to know that because it'll say in there, like, our discipline will progress. And I think if there's a kid that's making everyone's life miserable at school for the entire year, then we would look at a different placement for them, like an online school or something. But we want to give kids a chance to change their behavior because they are still kids, their brains are still developing, and they're human beings too.
And that's definitely one of the behaviors that we've struggled with, and that's why we've implemented the check, because if it goes for 2 weeks and said, well, they left me alone for 2 weeks and they did something, and you find out that a month later they did it, I'm like, okay, so something happened 2 weeks after this happened, we need to know about that, right?
So we can investigate, check cameras,
And
energy.
Cleaver didn't do anything.
Yeah.
Right.
And so those are the things that we just look in terms of people understanding policies and like kind of the reporting process, right? I think it's probably the hardest part, that you're gonna have to come back and when an incident occurs, it has to be immediate. And there's lots of things we do to make it more discreet, I guess, lack for a better word, so kids don't feel like they're tattletelling, right? Meaning that we know there's this period conflict in class, and all those teachers know, right? And so if there's one class, a lot of times we just look at the class schedule and say, how can we not have you in the same classes together? Easy, right? And if that does happen, we can't do that. Now we know this is happening in third period. So we put the third period teacher on notice, right? And the third period teacher, if it's an ongoing behavior, it's getting a repetitive pattern and the teacher is going to see it happen. Or when we do groupings, we make sure that they're in different locations in the room, right? They don't work in peer groups. Or we do things like we'll put one of their peers in class with them as a witness. Does that make sense? Or as a support mechanism, as an upstander, right? Because odds are if there's two of them, that kind of changes the power structure a little bit, right? It's not one person. There's now two people on the same team, right? Because if he or she then has their friend in that class, it gives them a little more strength in numbers, right? And it also gives them a witness, right?
We put kids on like what I'd call a no contact order, where they will sign and call both parents, and they're just supposed to avoid each other because we've tried all these things and it just doesn't work. And if somebody violates that, then there'll be immediate consequences, that type of thing. So really, the answer is that we just sometimes we'll address the situation as it comes up.
Mm-hmm.
There's a threat assessment process. I don't know if you heard that part about that. We've gone through that 3 or 4 times, and that can trigger a safety plan like he was talking about earlier, where you restrict kids and all that stuff too. But we do try to understand their kids.
May I ask, Darren, if the parent who came to the board meeting, if that parent filed a public complaint?
No.
She did not. She did not. So, and I've said that, and Ryan Hawkins has said this very well. He said, just because they don't fill that form out doesn't absolve us of responding. Right? So we need to still respond. If it came in a public board meeting, or if it came through an email or even a phone call, we still need to respond. We would prefer that it was on the KLAR. Sometimes if you tell parents, hey, if you feel like you exhausted, wherever you can go fill out KL-AR and submit it, and we will get a response back to you.
Well, it just helps to have a paper trail.
It does. So that the parent came to the board meeting is great, but there's a paper trail in the minutes that Megan types up the next day. So anyway, thank you all. Those are great
Any other questions or concerns on the bullying issue? Alrighty. You guys need to leave.
Thank you.
We need to talk about that. Keep up the good work. I'm not sorry.
Hawkins, you can do it. So Brett Jackson is sick today. He wasn't able to be at school. His family is still in town from Iowa. He grew up in Iowa, but his parents came from Iowa for Thanksgiving. They're leaving tomorrow. He wanted to spend good time. So Jackson would have been there with us. So we let the dollars Thanks all.
Is it all right for you here?
Thank you all very much.
My stuff.
And now, Crystal,
So Crystal, come up
we
with
need a
you.
big audience for Crystal.
Hi, am I supposed to have a presentation?
No,
Okay.
just questions. There's a question.
On camera, Crystal.
So the really good question is asked. We have talked about our high school HVAC. The money that we receive from ESSER is going to pay the majority of that, but we are short. And the question is, where is that coming from, and what will that do to our budget? So I wanted the board to be aware of that.
So tell us how short.
Well, so I think when the project first started, because we had 2.9 million from the ESSER funding, that was our budget, right? And that's what we told, that's what we put in our RFP when we were recruiting a general contractor. And I think that was the ultimate goal. And then I think once things went to bid, we can't do it for that amount, obviously. And we've been told that. I would like to give Bennington credit because I do think they got some of their prices down from August to now. But we are still short. It's looking like after all construction costs, design fees, total project cost, hopefully will be 4.3 million. So we have 2.9 million, so we're short about 1.4 million. It is my understanding from reading everything that they said to Darren that they won't start on any of this until after school ends in May of 2023. So that puts us into our final fiscal month for the budget that we have created right now, which we do have 2.9 million budgeted for the ESSER funding. What I was looking at, we have our 440 fund, which is called our Facilities and Management Fund, that's what we call it. We have a balance in there of about $717,000. It was closer to $1 million, but we did do some funding to redo the track and redo the tennis courts. So we do have that money in there. We do have a contingency of a little over, 2.1 million is what we budgeted in there. But really looking at it in 2 weeks, when we meet 3 weeks, you'll be presented the audit for our fiscal year last year from our auditor. And I think when I did the budget, because remember it's the best guess I could give, I do think I did not budget enough in our ending fund balance, which then becomes our beginning fund balance of this year's budget. And I think it's going to be more than enough to cover our shortfall.
Yeah, sure.
Is that without touching the contingency?
Without touching our contingency.
Without
Touching the 700,000. Of course, I don't want to tell you exactly what's in that because he's not done with this audit, and I want him to present that to you. So hopefully we can wrap that up, and it will be wrapped up.
The 2.9 or the 1.3.
So then I think the expenditures that are going to come out in June, because this is when this project, the majority of it's going to start. I feel like our budget right now, we do have a 2.9 million budgeted. That can come from there right now, and then as I develop our fiscal year 24 budget, and I adjust that beginning fund balance, and then what I need to know from the board, the budget committee, and Mr. Johnson, where do you want me to budget that additional money? Whether I should just put it in our maintenance fund that this money will come out of, or should I put it in the fund 440? I don't anticipate us blowing through more than 2.9 million by June 30th of 2023.
Wouldn't it probably go in 440?
That's
For next
year. The board wishes.
I guess it doesn't really matter.
We have a capital outlay account in our general fund for maintenance.
That's what Jesse uses for finishing the gym floors and for every other.
What we use for refrigeration.
Yep.
Last year.
Do we know for sure that it's not going to be more than 4.3? Are they going to raise it?
Well, they did give us
They factored
guaranteed
in
maximum.
a little bit of, I think they factored, 10%?
I think they reduced it to 5.
Actually, the last meeting we had, and Pat, I think you were there, it was 4.5 million, so it has come down from
Yes.
4.2.
They did budget 5%
5%.
of contingency. So, and hopefully they
Well,
won't spend
I
that.
don't know what they're going to see when they get in there.
That's true. That is a good point.
And then other things,
Pull the roof off, and they're like, what?
Megan and I have been bombarding Darren with grant ideas that have come across. We get emails with random stuff sometimes, so I have sent a lot of things to Darren. Kind of hit or miss, I don't know. Don't have a lot of time to look into stuff, but I have sent him a lot that maybe we could get some extra money.
Well, I'll tell you, I spoke with Lori Holcomb. I think I told some of you about her. So she used to write grants for the Ontario School District. She used to be on our school board here, those of you who remember her. She's a neighbor of mine, but that's not why I spoke. She actually had spoken to me when I first came here about her expertise in writing grants for youth involvement activities in Ontario. And I reached out to her and said, hey, what about grants for air quality improvement in buildings, right? And so there were some that we missed from a year ago when the deadline came, but there's still some out there that we can look at. One of the ones she suggested is to reach out to our county commissioners, which I am doing, in the process of doing, because they have received a $6 million windfall for who knows exactly what, but so we may be able to access some additional monies. you know, my goal, and I hope, and I know the board's goal, is to preserve as much money we can for our operations as we can without spending our ending fund balance down, or beginning fund. It is nice to have a cushion. I think there are people out there who believe that a big savings account means that we're not spending money on what we should spend money on, for whatever reason. And so I just think it's responsible. We have not just the HVAC system. I mean, that could expand, to be honest. We looked at the HVAC. Jesse informs me that all of the HVAC systems in the auditorium and elsewhere are the same age, right? They're not any different than what's in the high school. But when we asked Benetton what it would take to add the auditorium to this process, it was cost prohibitive at the time. So that is the reason that we preserve money for the district. One of the many reasons, right? That the board tries to, we want to give raises to our teachers, we want our faculty, our employees to feel valued, and financially is part of how that we do that. It's not all that we do, but it's part of it. And that requires fiscal responsibility. So I appreciate you being here, Crystal.
You're welcome.
So December board meeting is the audit.
Yeah, so, Mr. White will present in the December meeting, and then I'll start on the budget right after the new year, so I'll just, probably just be speaking with you a lot to get direction of where you want me to budget that money from.
And I will keep you informed.
Whether that comes,
Because it's
whether we
financial.
put it in the general fund, or if we do stick it in Fund 440, that probably is easier to manage and pull numbers really fast as opposed to combining it with general fund expenditures and,
Because then Jesse thinks it's his.
so.
It is,
It's
what I'm gonna
easier to
spend on the
track.
HVAC. That's-
Exactly, with that stability.
Is this just simply to update the HVAC system, or is it not working at the high school?
That's not very good.
It's 46 years old, it's the same age as the building. It was supposed to last 25 years max, and it's 46 now. And so it is actually falling apart.
Right.
And there's other aspects of the roof that
That's the
has
high
to be
school.
addressed
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I know,
When the snow hit, they have problems.
So this is HVAC and roof, we're going to need a roof too to support
I
it,
know that
which,
we responded to the fire department here a while back with the issue over there. That was going on, yeah.
So we were in Craig Fournier's room trying to figure out where the smoke was coming from.
Yeah, there's issues.
And I know like two rooms can be next to each other, one can be freezing cold, and one can be boiling hot, from the heater and air conditioner running at the same time. Really.
It's just,
it's bad.
Well, and the roof has to be enforced to hold those.
And we have $3 million on waste.
And we have reported to the state, with assessor money, that that's what we're spending it on, and it is approved, and
It's
so.
all okay.
It's an okay, we have our project tag number, we have to do it, or we'll lose it.
Jesse's wondering if he needs to be here, so let me respond. No, you don't need to.
Crystal?
Yes, do we have, you mentioned budget committee.
Yes.
Do we have members who have to be reappointed or appointed?
We need to get doings.
And I'm only asking because I'd like to.
Might need to start advertising for you.
Off the top of my head, I can't remember how many.
When's the next time
What is it?
we need to get the budget committee together? Is it January or February?
So I presented a budget calendar in July, and I think,
You don't remember? Sorry.
I think we don't meet really officially until the end of April. I think, don't put me on that, but, we might need to meet a little sooner, then that'll adjust my calendar, so. I'll have it there.
So we can get it most taken care of so that they can start.
There are 3 spots. Thank you.
Who is it?
Dave Wunschler, Hilda Contreras, and Noel.
Or July 1, June
I just think that would be good to.
30.
Which one?
Who? Dave, yeah, he does. I think Will was on. Ross Ross wants to be done. He's asked to be done.
But he's not up for reappointment.
I think he's out this year.
Look at this. Well, he said, I don't want to do this anymore. So I don't know. Anxiety's
We'll
not-
figure it out.
If he's gonna resign, then we need to know.
Yeah, he needs to officially.
But I think it would be helpful to gauge with the pressure on it.
I'm gonna get through the audit first.
Are you talking about me or are you talking about the budget?
Just trying to get the budget committee so we know, instead of waiting until the very last
Yeah, and if we
minute.
need to get new people, let's get them now so we're ready. Start. Okay, any other talk about the HVAC system?
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get my bell. I thought I had created this, so we started it.
Okay, meeting is adjourned.